Welcome back. This is Professor Patchell, American Literature, and this is my short lecture on my micro lecture on the wound dresser. I call this lecture, Yet Life Struggles Hard. It's a line from the poem. And this poem is Whitman's retrospective poem. It's another one of his poems, very similar to Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking, where he creates an older persona. The speaker is an older man who is looking back on his wartime experience. This is really interesting because when Whitman wrote the poem, he was only 40 years old. Maybe in the mid 1800s, that seemed old, but he's not really an old man like he would seem to have to be in the poem. This is why we usually distinguish between the speaker of the poem and the author of the poem. So while the speaker of the poem certainly is Whitman to some extent, we consider it a fictional Whitman, and this is a Whitman in the future, and he's looking back on his time in the Civil War and his time with the wounded and dying soldiers in the Civil War, mostly at the open-air hospitals around Washington, D.C. Of course, that is not mentioned in the poem, but that's what we know historically. We want to stick with the details of the poem. We have an older man, and it's got this sense of nostalgia. There's younger people, young lads and maidens who want to know what he remembers from the war. This older, you can imagine sort of like an older, maybe considered wiser man who's looking back on his life. I really think that this is one of the peaks of Whitman's realism. When Whitman begins, he still has, and I think it always stays with him, he has a little bit of transcendentalism left over in him. Uh, Actually, quite a lot of transcendentalism in his early works, like Song of Myself. Uh, the Wound Dresser is high realism, I would call it. It's observations of real life. It's objective. It's descriptive. It's got a lot of graphic detail of gore and amputated limbs and wounds. In fact, the poem is called The Wound Dresser. And it's based on the inspiration, obviously, comes from Whitman's time in the war hospitals, tending to both the Union and Confederate soldiers. Tim O'Brien, the American author Tim O'Brien, has a collection called The Things We Carried. Maybe some of you have read it. And in that, there's a story called How to Tell a True War Story. And one of the things that O'Brien tells us is that, if you hear a war story that talks about honor or about, some sort of victory or anything that's good, it's probably a false war story. O'Brien says that you can tell a true war story by its absolute and unflinching allegiance to obscenity and evil. And I think that we get that to some extent with the graphic descriptions in The Wound Dresser by Whitman. We get descriptions of, particularly in section 3 of the poem, we get descriptions of the crushed head I dress, poor crazed hand, tear not the bandage away. The neck of the cavalryman with the bullet through and through I examine. Hard the breathing rattles, quite glazed already the eye, yet life struggles hard. We're used to hearing stories about valor on the battlefield, about acts of bravery, about those kinds of things. The Wound Dresser is about the bravery that comes in dying and in surviving horrible wounds. This was a time when they did not have contemporary sterilizing techniques, very primitive medicine. In fact, many medical breakthroughs were made during the Civil War. Wars often bring us new things along with a lot of wounded and dead people. So, though the poem is based on Whitman's experience in the open air hospitals in and around Washington, D.C., the speaker is kind of this old man recounting his days as a nurse caring for the mostly severely wounded of both sides, North and South. The poem's tone is solemn. There's a tone of resignation. There's a tone of reflection. It's contemplative. This is what war produces, right? It's and the speaker, much like Whitman himself, recalls that when the war started, that he called for endless, urgent war. He sounded the alarum, get the troops ready. Remember, Whitman was an abolitionist. He was very passionate about the Civil War. I think that many wars start with a lot of passion, but this is the end result of wars, right? It's the wounded and the dead and the people that have taken the toll of the war. In the bulk of sections 2 and 3 of the poem, we get the brutal and sensory specifics of the wounded. I read you the line about the crushed head, about the cavalry officer with the neck wound where a bullet went through. We get to hear his rattling breath. There's parts in this poem where it almost seems like the speaker wishes for euthanasia. Come soon, death. Those types of sentiments are here, right? Because some of these people are suffering so badly. It seems that there is no comfort for them in this piece. I think that the poem really does a good job of capturing both the graphic physical destruction and damage that war causes to the human body, that war can cause to the human body, but also the long-lasting psychological effects. And that idea that life struggles hard, it's almost like it's trying to hang on, that bearing these kinds of wounds, this kind of destruction, is just as heroic as charging into battle, as facing the cannons. That now these soldiers who've been through all of that are getting gangrene. They're getting limbs amputated. Just a sort of a historical fact, there were so many amputations during the Civil War that it was very common for people, particularly in the South, to be missing limbs. In fact, in 1868, the number one budget item for the state of Mississippi was artificial limbs. Okay. I want to kind of bring to light something else about this graphic detail and this shocking, and this would have been shocking to these sort of Victorian middle class audiences. There had really never been anything quite like this published. And I really see the beginning of a veterans literature of the United States coming out of the wound dresser. And we're often so focused on the actual battles, the fighting, the strategy, the wins, the losses, all of those things, that we don't often get to see the actual effects of the war, of what war can do to human bodies and to lives and to families and to people. And we get that in the wound dresser. And people would have been shocked, but it was also, this is what literature does. It challenges the mores of the time. It challenges comfort, really. A lot of literature makes us uncomfortable, and certainly the wound dresser does make us uncomfortable. I want to say just a couple things about PTSD. Of course, this poem was written long before PTSD was a diagnosis, but the poem has it just has the feeling. So if you do write about that, you make the distinction. There was no such diagnosis as PTSD. at this time, but the speaker of the poem, a couple of times in the poems, it's almost like a repetition, says that in sleep and dreams, right? In silence, in dreams, projections. In silence, in dreams, projections, this comes back to him, right? And people who are suffering from PTSD have are often haunted by memories when they're awake, but also of vivid dreams when they're asleep of the experiences that they went through. And here's an interesting tidbit about PTSD. This is post-traumatic stress disorder, is that one of the hallmarks of PTSD is that the person who's suffering from it was unable to do anything to stop the horrible things that they saw and experienced. And we get that from this wound dresser, the speaker of the poem, through Whitman's writing, that the speaker works and works, comes with hinged knees, takes care of all these soldiers, hugs them, kisses them, but in many cases can do nothing to help them except for clean their wounds, change their bandages, try to comfort them as much as possible. But beyond that, there's a feeling of helplessness, and this feeling of helplessness can contribute. It's one of the major contributors to those who suffer from PTSD. I've always sort of seen this poem in that light. I think there are other ways to read it, but I think that it really does show another side of war. And I don't think it's being critical of war. I think that, I mean, in some ways it is. You could make that argument. But I think that it's also telling us something about the acceptance of mortality that is going to make these young men, and they were very young men, most of the casualties of the Civil War were very young men, that they are facing their death with resignation, with maybe not hope, but with a kind of a strange resolve that is part of the human spirit. And that is that line that stands out to me, yet life struggles hard. It's like humans will hang on. They will try to keep living, even under the most horrible circumstances. And the speaker of the poem, even at one point, says, "You know, I think I could not refuse this moment to die for you, if that would save you." Right? That's a powerful sentiment. That the speaker is saying, "Oh my God, there's this young guy. He's dying in front of me. I would gladly take his place if I could, but I know I can't. There's nothing I can do for this poem." So the poem ends going back with, "Thus in silence, in dreams, projections, returning, resuming, I thread my way through the hospitals, the hurt and wounded. I pacify with soothing hand. I sit by the restless all the dark night. Some are so young, some suffer so much. I recall the experience sweet and sad." Sweet and sad. It's a powerful sentiment. How many things are sweet and sad? A lot of human experience. "Many a soldier's loving arms about this neck have crossed and rested. Many a soldier's kiss dwells on these bearded lips." So it's not just about changing the wounds and dressing them, but it's also about comforting the wounded and the dying. And I think it's interesting. I'm going to end where I started with, this old man and these young people saying, "Hey, what do you remember about the war?" And the old man gets very reflective, contemplative, and it's not about a battle or about some heroic charge or somebody sacrificing to save a bunch of people, anything like that. It's about suffering and dying and facing that with the spirit of life. Thank you.